o'clock news from the BBC with Peter Sissons and Moira Stuart.
Good evening. The headlines at 6 o'clock. President Bush praises Israel's continued restraint in the face of last night's attack by Iraq when 7 Scud missiles landed on Israel. He describes it as purely an act of terror and says Saddam Hussein's efforts to weaken the coalition will not work. Israel clears up the wreckage. Its government meets to decide whether to retaliate. The Americans say they've destroyed 6 mobile Scud missile launchers and located 5 more. The first pictures from Allied warplanes show the precision of the bombing. This was the Iraqi Air Force headquarters and Britain's Tornado aircrew. Their courage, says the Defense Secretary, is inspirational. Within the last hour, President Bush says Israel has shown great restraint in not retaliating against Iraq, following the missile attack last night against 2 of its cities. Mr. Bush said everyone realized that Saddam Hussein was trying to break the Allied coalition by its action, but such efforts would fail. In Israel, the government says it hasn't decided whether to retaliate. The Foreign Minister, David Levy, said the country still retained the right to respond in any way it saw fit. In the Gulf itself, the American commander, General Norman Schwarzkopf, said that 6 of Iraq's mobile rocket launchers of the type which may have been used for the attack on Israel had been located and destroyed. 5 others were being relentlessly attacked. And this afternoon comes more news of the Allied air offensive against Iraq. American B-52 bombers are said to have inflicted extensive damage on the outskirts of Baghdad. As the Allied bombing offensive continues, there are reports tonight that Saddam Hussein's wife and family have fled to the West African country of Mauritania. But President Bush warned against the mood of euphoria that greeted the early Allied successes. War, he said, was never cheap nor easy. Israel's war cabinet has been in session throughout the day to consider its response to last night's Iraqi missile attacks. Its foreign minister has said Israel still retained the right to retaliate. The missile attack on Israel came shortly after midnight. At least 7 Scud missiles were launched at Israel, 2 exploding in a suburb of Tel Aviv, 2 in Haifa, with 2 others landing in unpopulated areas. 12 people were slightly injured.
The remains of a house in Tel Aviv after this morning's Scud missile attacks. Miraculously, it seems that only 7 people were hurt. Although civil defense teams were wearing full protective clothing, these were conventional warheads. 8 missiles landed altogether in the Haifa and Tel Aviv central area. There was no warning of them. Inside the house, rooms were wrecked. The relief here is that it was not a chemical attack and that no one was killed. A woman who was in the house at the time described what happened.
My room was the only one sealed. The glass exploded. All of us didn't know what to do. My father, I called an ambulance for him, which took him to the hospital. My mother fainted. Everything's amiss.
This was the reaction of one Jerusalem family when the air raid siren went off at 2 a.m. The father is a TV cameraman, and he captured the panic felt here as expectations grew that there was about to be a chemical attack. In Tel Aviv, hospitals had been well prepared. The injured from the Scud attacks were treated quickly. Several of the victims had panicked and injected themselves with atropine, fearing that they had inhaled gas. This was what remained of one of the missiles which landed on residential apartments in Tel Aviv's northern suburbs. A family of 4, including 2 young girls, were asleep at the time. Like several of the other missiles, the warhead did not explode properly. Soldiers weren't taking any chances as they continued their search this morning for missiles which may not have exploded. At daybreak, some locals still weren't convinced that they were out of danger. Then, later today, to the issue of retaliation. and whether or not Israel's Air Force would strike Baghdad. At a meeting at the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, it was decided to hold off and await further developments. Publicly on tactics, the Israelis are saying nothing.
We are facing now the blitz on Israel's cities, and it may very well, there may very well be another attack tonight. But you notice that so far we're contemplating what we're doing. We haven't jumped knee-jerk, taken out our gun, so to speak, and fired from the hip. We understand the difficulties, we understand the considerations, but we also understand this. We're a sovereign country. We have an obligation to defend our citizens against this savagery, and we will exercise that right when and as we see fit.
Israel's reputation down the years has not been one of reticence when it comes to battle. It often boasts that preemption in 1967 was the key to winning the war in 6 days. But 24 years on, the Middle East has changed. Israel's great ally America is siding with an Arab alliance against Iraq, and fear of splitting that alliance and being seen to be hungry for war has to be a major factor in Israel's decision to hold back now. If Iraq attacks again, however, it will be a different ballgame, and then Israel's entry into this war would, according to sources here, be inevitable. Michael MacMillan, BBC News in Jerusalem.
Michael MacMillan filing that report before President Bush's remarks on the missile attack and its implications, remarks made at the White House within the hour. We've just received this report from our chief North America correspondent, Gavin Esler.
The White House has settled into its new top security routine with frequent comings and goings of the president's war cabinet and urgent telephone calls to Israel and Arab allies on the immediate crisis. Mr. Bush said the allies must guard against such Scud missile attacks, changing the political course of the war by shifting it to an Arab-Israeli confrontation.
Israel is not a participant. Israel is not a combatant. And this man is elected to launch a terroristic attack against the population centers in Israel with no military design whatsoever. And that's why, and it is an outrage, and the whole world knows it, and the whole world is, most of the countries in the world are speaking out against it.
The president clearly hopes Israel will not retaliate, leaving it to Allied air power, but he did not rule out an Israeli attack.
Israel has shown great restraint, and I've said that. I think we can all understand that they have their own problems that come from this, but I don't want to go further into it because we are right in the midst of consultations with Israel. I think they, like us, do not want to see this war widened out.
And there was a warning that early victories might delude public opinion into thinking war was easy.
No one should doubt or question the ultimate success because we will prevail. But I don't want to see us get overly euphoric about all of this.
The possibility of Iraqi terrorism as warfare by other means has led to increased security at some Washington embassies. But after a CIA briefing, the Senate Intelligence Committee was less coy than the president about saying Israel will not strike back.
We were told that it's been made public that they're not going to retaliate at the time, at this moment. That's what we were told.
At the United Nations, the predictable Iraqi attack led to an equally predictable response.
Well, I must say that I most regret these attacks. First, because of it helps us spread in the conflict, as Israel is not a part of the coalition. And second, because the targets were civilian targets.
With still more U.S. troops heading towards the Gulf, the initial Allied successes have clearly boosted morale on the home front too.
Way to go. Thank God for the Air Force.
But as the anti-war demonstrations continue, Iraq will be able to shock, if not utterly surprise. Yet the president will be pleased to learn 3 out of 4 Americans support the war effort, at least for the moment. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
The latest reports from Baghdad say there have been more attacks by Allied warplanes. There's reportedly been widespread damage to the city. The Iraqi authorities say there have been 23 deaths during the Allied air raids. The Information Minister, Latif Jassim, said that the Iraqis have captured several American pilots. Our Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson, sent this report.
Mr. Jassim told the hastily arranged news conference in the darkened building of his ministry that Iraq had already won its victory. It wasn't just to be a 2-day war after all, he said. and that for him appeared to be victory in itself. When I asked him how he could describe it as victory when so much had been destroyed, he smiled and said it was wrong to rely on technology aids like computers alone. I asked him later if Iraq had captured any Allied pilots. Yes, he said, and we would soon be taken to see them. New air raids have been taking place this evening, and the sirens began wailing soon after the minister had finished speaking. From the size and power of the raid, B-52 bombers may well have been used. Soon after the bombs began falling, a major target was hit and went up in spectacular flames. Under the terms of the censorship here, it's impossible for us to go into any more details. Further spectacular damage was done later. Our satellite telephone dish was jammed while the raid was on, presumably by the AWACS aircraft guiding the B-52s to their target. The Iraqis said this morning that 23 civilians had so far been killed in the bombing, a surprisingly small number in the circumstances. In Baghdad itself, if the paper is to be believed, only 2 people died. The biggest danger is probably the falling tracer bullets fired from anti-aircraft guns. The streets of Baghdad have mostly been empty today. President Saddam Hussein was shown on television and in the newspapers as having walked down Rashid Street in the center of town yesterday, but there were few people in the crowd around him even so. Today, it's been possible to see a few kebab stalls out on the streets, and some tea houses and general shops are open. But there's no fresh produce, and most people must be living on stocks of food and water which they accumulated before the fighting began. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
John Simpson, like all the foreign journalists in Baghdad, is subject to military censorship. But earlier, he was able to phone through to the BBC's live news programme and give David Dimbleby more details of today's raid on Baghdad.
We, in fact, tried a little bit earlier, but our satellite telephone system here was completely swamped by the signals being sent out, we think, by AWACS aircraft guiding in the latest raid from B-52 bombers, which came over in the last hour and did an extraordinary amount of damage in the outskirts of Baghdad.
What other information do you have on the effect of the bombing on Baghdad? Did he talk about that at all?
I think I've got to be a bit careful about this. We'll just see. No, I think I can tell you, actually. The figure, heads seem to be turned in other directions. A great power station on the outskirts of the city was blown up with fantastic, spectacular results. And also the telecommunications tower, where in fact the dishes had been hanging off already, that went up in a shower of flame and sparks and made quite a show.
What impression did you get about the way in which Saddam is planning to pursue this war now then from this? Did you get any inkling of what their strategy is going to be?
I didn't really. I mean, I think the strategy is what it always was, which is to hang on, to resist, to carry on, to survive, as it were, the great attack, everything that the Americans and their allies were going to throw at them, and then at the end, simply to by surviving, to win. And I think that must still be the intention. I think that's what the purpose is. I'm being told to stop now. I'm sorry.
But he keeps trying to start again. He keeps trying to get through to us. And if he does in the next 45 minutes, we'll take him straight away. Moira.
Well, the American general who commands all the Allied forces in the Gulf has said that Operation Desert Storm was going according to plan. General Norman Schwarzkopf said his forces were flying 2,000 sorties a day and they were hitting their targets 80% of the time. First pictures from Allied warplanes show the extraordinary precision of the bombings in both Iraq and Kuwait. And as we've heard, General Schwarzkopf said Allied aircraft have destroyed 6 of the Iraqis' mobile missile launchers.
With an understandably elaborate security escort, the man in charge of the Allied attack made his first public appearance since it began and gave the first detailed account of how it's going. General Schwarzkopf is a veteran of Vietnam and of Grenada, but never has he had such military might at his command. Allied aircraft, he said, are flying 2,000 sorties a day. Their success rate against Iraqi targets is 80%, but now the priority is the Scud missiles Saddam Hussein has still got left.
As you know, finding the fixed missile launchers is a relatively easy business, but finding the mobile launchers is like finding a needle in a haystack, as you can well imagine. This morning, the United States Air Force found 3 mobile erector launchers with missiles on board inside Iraq. These launchers were obviously aimed at Saudi Arabia, given their positions. Those 3 mobile elector launchers have been destroyed. In addition to that, at the same time, we found 8 more mobile erector launchers in the same location. We are currently attacking those launchers, and we have confirmed the destruction of 3 more of those mobile erector launchers, and we are continuing to attack the others, and I assure you we will attack them relentlessly until either we are prevented from attacking them any further by weather or we have destroyed them all.
The general reported that 7 Allied aircraft are missing in action, 2 of them British Tornadoes and a Kuwaiti plane whose pilot is apparently safe in the hands of resistance fighters. But he stressed attacks will continue and with pinpoint accuracy.
We're doing absolutely everything we possibly can in this campaign to avoid injuring or hurting or destroying innocent people.
And the way the American Air Force are trying to prove their accuracy is with these pictures, a bomber's view of Baghdad. The target here is the headquarters of the Iraqi Air Force, and Lieutenant General Charles Horner, architect of the Allied bombardment, talked reporters through the mission.
And this is my counterpart's headquarters in Baghdad. This is the headquarters of the Air Force, and keep your eye on all sides of the building as the airplane overflies the building and drops the bomb down through the center of the building.
On this occasion, the target is a Scud missile bunker in Kuwait. Like many others, it's about to be destroyed by laser-guided bombs, a technique first tried in Vietnam, but now developed to produce devastating accuracy. From 2 miles away, the F-111 directs its bombs into the door of the bunker.
And you'll be able to count each bomb. 1, 2.
At this air defense headquarters, the bomb again follows the laser beam into the building, but the way in is even more ingenious.
These are air shafts that provide best access into this concrete structure. And keep your eye on the front door, the airlock door, as debris comes out the door from the bomb going in this lead-in air shaft.
Here, the target's already been hit once by a stealth bomber, but it's still standing, so a second plane comes in to finish off the mission.
And this part of the building here provides some structural weakness that will be exploited in this attack, and the bomb will hit in this area here.
Airfields, too, are vital targets, of course, and this one is halfway between Baghdad and Kuwait. American pilots use the same combination of skill and laser technology to do the damage in the very center of the runway.
And now you'll see the pilot switch to higher magnification and as he flies away from the target. This is the smoke plume from the bomb, and there's the crater.
Under this relentless bombardment, Iraqi troop morale appears to be further eroding. 10 soldiers deserted today, according to a Saudi Arabian general here in Riyadh. He said they're being treated as military refugees, not as prisoners of war. These French jets joined the aerial onslaught today, taking off to attack an ammunition dump in southern Kuwait. When General Schwarzkopf was asked today if Saddam Hussein himself is also a target, he replied that the Allies are not trying to kill any particular person. Ben Brown, BBC News, Saudi Arabia.
One of the Scud missiles fired last night was aimed towards Saudi Arabia. Launched from the southern Iraqi city of Basra, it was aimed at one of the Allied air bases near Dhahran. But it was destroyed in one of the first successful interceptions of a Scud in flight.
At 4:30 this morning, Dhahran heard the sound everyone dreads, the alert for an incoming Iraqi Scud missile. As pilots at the airbase scrambled to get off the ground, civilians ran for shelter. In an atmosphere of fear and tension, the American Army launched the only antidote to Scud, one of its own Patriot anti-missile missiles. It climbed to intercept the Scud and destroyed it. On slow motion, the final destructive explosion can be clearly seen. The Patriot looks more like a dumper lorry than a missile system, but today, on its first ever firing in wartime, its operators kept their heads as the Scud came towards them.
Always on edge. You don't have time to take a break. When you're talking a matter of seconds, it's life or death to thousands of people, to include ourselves. We've got to take a break.
There was not just one Allied response today, but a multitude of them, as the air power of Operation Desert Storm took the war deep inside Iraq. The precision of the cruise missile fired from the Gulf today makes Saddam's Soviet-designed Scud seem crude and inaccurate.
3, 2, 1, launch.
Missile away!
Yes, sir.
Today, they destroyed Saddam Hussein's palace. Allied fighter bombers have been staging hundreds of sorties today. American pilots returning from missions over Baghdad and Kuwait are still reporting an absence of coordinated Iraqi Air Force resistance.
It appears the kills that we've gotten up to this point have been, again, really not an organized air opposition. I think they're guys that basically got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The Allies are attacking Saddam's elite Republican Guard divisions on the Iraq-Kuwait border.
These are good troops. You know, they're not going to scare that easily. But I think definitely if you look at a sustained around-the-clock bombing campaign against them, it's going to get to them. It's going to have a very much of a demoralizing effect.
Anything military that moves in Kuwait is a potential target. But not all goes to plan, despite the meticulous detailing of each operation.
It wasn't real successful because evidently the fortified positions must have moved during the night. They do that occasionally. So well, we got up there and didn't find our original target because the prepared positions were empty. But we found a secondary target, dropped on it.
The absolute priority for the Allied air forces is finding Iraq's remaining mobile Scud launchers. The somber reality is there could be several more hidden away. For everyone within Scud range, that's less than 300 miles, this is going to be a night of waiting. Dhahran itself seems calm. Most people are in their homes because this is the Muslim Sabbath. They've almost lost count at the airbase of the number of air raid alerts. But at least places like this are protected by the Americans' Patriot anti-missile system. Barron, BBC News, Eastern Saudi Arabia.
And the Allied Forces Commander, General Schwarzkopf, has stressed that destroying the Scud's mobile launchers is an airstrike priority. The Scuds are seen as the most potent weapon at the Iraqis' disposal, because they're capable of delivering chemical and biological weapons deep into neighboring territory. Our defense correspondent, David Shukman, assesses the Iraqi missile threat.
Of all the weaponry Saddam Hussein has acquired over the years, it's the 1,000 Scud missiles sold to him by Moscow that have always struck the greatest fear in his neighbors. Some 600 of the missiles were fired at Tehran in the War of the Cities 3 years ago. Their impact, though damaging and wounding, was mainly psychological, since each one only delivers the equivalent of a small bomb. Of Saddam's remaining 400 Scuds, exactly like these filmed in Afghanistan, he's used up an unknown number to develop longer-range versions, and the estimate is that it takes 3 original Scuds to make 2 of the stretched versions. The result, possibly, is an Iraqi missile force now numbering 150. But the advantage of the extra range Saddam has achieved is obvious as he moves to involve Israel. The original Scuds only reach some 300 kilometers, the adapted Al-Hussein perhaps 450, while the Al-Abbas, the derivative with the longest range, was almost certainly the type aimed at Israel last night. The attack could, in theory, have been stopped because although Israel's own anti-missile system, shown here, isn't yet operational, America provided dozens of its Patriot missiles to Israel last month. They can strike incoming weapons and proved it in Saudi Arabia last night. The American missile rising under computer guidance to intercept the Iraqi Scud, falling at 3,000 miles per hour. It worked. The Allied preference is to send in bombers to destroy the missiles before they're launched. They've been trying that since the air campaign began, and this morning the American Gulf commander announced they'd had some success, that the attacks were still continuing, but that it was like looking for a needle in a haystack until the missiles are used. Then, once the launches start, the sites can be spotted by spy satellites, whose infrared sensors would detect the launch sites. The coordinates can be passed to AWACS radar planes over Saudi Arabia, and they can then direct bombers there, but by then all they can do is prevent further launches. Still unclear is why the missiles fired last night were fitted with conventional, not chemical warheads, as Saddam had threatened. Either the intelligence is wrong, and Iraq simply can't fit chemical payloads to its missiles, a difficult technical task, or Saddam believed a chemical attack on Israel might produce a nuclear response.
The first pictures of Wednesday night's air attack on Baghdad have now reached London. They were filmed by a BBC crew with our Foreign Affairs editor, John Simpson.
The sirens went off at 20 to 3, and even before that, the big machine guns on the tops of buildings around here were firing tracer into the sky. I was out with two colleagues in a car when the attack began. There was, of course, very little traffic on the roads at that point, and the tracer began springing up all round us. Our driver refused to take us any further and insisted on going back to the hotel, where we watched the battle from a fifth-story window. At the moment, we're waiting for the American bombers to come. All the firing that's going on, and there's a great deal of it, is just pretty wildly up in the air. It doesn't seem to be aimed at anything. It looks as though they're just getting ready for the big attack, preparing themselves, and just firing at nothing. What we didn't know at that stage was that the Allied planes were too high for us to hear, and certainly too high for the outdated technology which Iraq has to hit, and the missiles, as they went over, made surprisingly little noise. The hotel staff, the other guests, and many of the journalists were down in the big shelters 50 feet below ground. After an initial panic, things calmed down quickly. People first of all became used to the overcrowding and the strange and bewildering conditions, and then they started to try to keep their spirits up and even enjoy themselves in a strange sort of way. Armed guards made it very difficult for us to get out of the shelters and back into the main part of the hotel, but in the end we managed it. At first light, the city looked virtually unchanged. The fears about carpet bombing and indiscriminate attacks on residential areas turned out to be unfounded. The bombs and the missiles seem mostly to have landed with pinpoint accuracy. The telecommunications center, which we couldn't film, was plugged neatly by at least 2 rockets. There was a cloud of smoke over the Defense Ministry, which had been completely taken out, presumably by missiles. We headed out again through the deserted streets. For the most part, only soldiers, whom, again, we couldn't get shots of, were around, leaderless and bewildered. We were quickly spotted and stopped by a security policeman in an unmarked car, but we managed to trick him into coming back to our hotel, where we gave him the slip.
This is a very strange war indeed. The only reminder you have that it's going on is the rumble of high explosive and the racket of the completely ineffective anti-aircraft fire from the ground. The technology which the Allied side has at its disposal has never been used before in anger. A few minutes ago, a missile, perhaps a Tomahawk or some other type of cruise missile, passed along the line of this road here at 100 feet high. What its target was, we don't know. John Simpson, BBC News, Baghdad.
The camera crew working with John Simpson are Brian Hulls and Colin Jones. The producer is Anthony Massey. He is now in Jordan, and he joins me now from Amman. Anthony, when war came to Baghdad, was it such a shock to the people there?
Yes, a total shock. It was something that they had never truly believed would happen, and although the journalists certainly always believed it would happen and had had some indication that the first raid would be when it did indeed occur, it certainly took the local people completely by surprise.
And the firing John Simpson drew attention to, he thought was fairly indiscriminate and unprepared. Was that the impression that you got too?
Oh yes, very much so. I mean, the anti-aircraft batteries that you saw used there, and which he described, are in great numbers throughout Baghdad. They're on the roofs of high buildings and on specially prepared earth mounds about 30 feet high in various parts of the town. But they were completely useless yesterday evening, and they were just firing randomly into the sky. They were they had no idea what they were shooting at, and they were doing no good at all. In fact, they were creating more danger than anything else, because there was a grey rain of shrapnel coming down in front of the hotel, which was their own shells.
And what about the noise? How did that strike you?
Well, the noise, excuse me, the noise of the anti-aircraft batteries was deafening, and was indeed our first indication that something had happened. But this was punctuated by a series of much louder explosions, which were the cruise missiles and other missiles finding their mark.
What about casualties? Is anybody saying anything about casualties? Was anyone saying anything about casualties when you left?
Well, they certainly weren't up to the moment when I left, which was the middle of yesterday afternoon. And from what I understand, they're not saying anything very much in Baghdad now, except to indicate that casualties are very light. That may well be true, because the interesting thing about the attacks yesterday, and even from what John was saying, the rather heavier attacks today, is that they have all been targeted very precisely on individual buildings. The telecommunications center he mentioned has a hole in one side. The floors in the middle are completely wrecked, and it's rubble inside, and the far wall is lying in the street, but the buildings all around it haven't been touched.
Anthony Massey.
That kind of accuracy is helpful.
I think we've just lost the line to a man just in time, as it happens. Moira.
And now, with the time at 6:32, the main headlines on day 2 of the Gulf War. President Bush publicly praises Israel for showing restraint in the face of an Iraqi attack. Once again, we see that no neighbor of Iraq is safe. The Israeli foreign minister says Israel retains the right to retaliate in any way it sees fit. And the Allied commander in the Gulf says 6 mobile Scud missile launchers have been destroyed and 5 others are under attack.